Top in the middle of the day to you, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. We're at the bench in the shop for another little narrative session. Today, for your viewing pleasure, we're going to take a look at a cs-620PW. So essentially, that's the wrap version of the CX620 from Echo. And so there you go. Throwing the disclaimers out right off the bat. I may slur and or stammer my speech. I call that slammering. I apologize in advance if I do. I haven't done a whole lot of research on this saw necessarily, except one of the things I did initially, and I'm going to throw this out there, weights and measures accurate, my scales are not. I checked the weights of this saw versus MS362 standard. It weighed 1 pound more on my scales exactly, so 12.3 versus 13.3, completely dry. And then both of them gained 1 pound after I filled them up with gas and oil, so then it ended up being 13.3 and 14.3. So I thought that was kind of interesting. 1 pound exactly dry, 1 pound exactly wet, but again, my scales aren't weights and measures accurate. As far as disclaimers going, check the description for any clarifications, qualifications, corrections. I'm only human. I make mistakes in this process. I didn't realize there was so much interest in this aspect of saws, so here you go, I guess, on that one. We'll take a look at this thing as we take it apart, I guess, essentially. I did run this thing in completely bone stock version, and it actually has some pretty good low end. It's a non-smog saw. It's kind of like a mini version XPW 372 as near as I can tell, but I don't want to do too much in the spoiler aspect, so we're just going to tear this thing down and take a look and see what we get. I kind of thought that the choke lever was interesting. It sticks out a long ways, and it's plastic. Knowing what I know about falling timber, especially working on steep ground and in brush holes and stuff like that, I'm thinking that that might be a little bit of a problem. I did like the little on-off switch, though. It's actually easy to operate with your thumb, and it works the opposite of what we see on some of the steel stuff. Down is actually off. It's easy to operate with your thumb in a hurry. I kind of like that. I ran this against the stock 362 in equal trim. One of the things I did initially, and I'm going to throw this out there, weights and measures accurate, my scales are not. I checked the weights of this saw versus MS362 standard. It weighed 1 pound more on my scales exactly, so 12.3 versus 13.3, completely dry. And then both of them gained 1 pound after I filled them up with gas and oil, so then it ended up being 13.3 and 14.3. So I thought that was kind of interesting. 1 pound exactly dry, 1 pound exactly wet, but again, my scales aren't weights and measures accurate. So we kind of discussed some of the overview, but long and tedious. Since we're at the bench, we're going to be talking about some of the stuff. I'm probably going to say interesting a lot in this process because as I go through, I look at stuff and I go, yeah, that's interesting. So here we go. I like the size of the knob on the back of the air cleaner cover, I will say. I thought that the flock situation that's going on with the air cleaner element itself was kind of cool. Better take a look inside there, see what's happening. Okay, so there's a little funky situation here that's an integral part of this, I would imagine. Keeps it stable, maybe. I don't even know. We'll have to like verify how that works, if it does keep it stable or not. I'm not actually positive. Yeah, I think that it's an integral part of the operation. This is going to restrict airflow, though. It's kind of interesting. A lot of times they're running baffles right on the back side of the carburetor, and what that does is help with the actual noise, the ambient noise. So there's a certain decibel level that saws have to actually adhere to. I could see that black, I don't even know what you want to call that thing, air guide, baffle, whatever, in there, and noticed that it was in there. So that's why we decided to take the air cleaner apart and check it out. This could be an aid to the noise situation as well. It's kind of interesting. They have a little bracket, but it's offset since the stud goes all the way through. Kind of an interesting little situation, but a lot of surface area on this particular element. They're using 27 Torx style heads on their bolts, which is kind of sweet. The carburetor is kind of hanging out there in outer space on the back side. In the initial saw test, I could not get this thing to turn up more than about 12,500 with the limiter caps on the carburetor. It's just the way it goes. They're running steel style push rod on the throttle shutter. I kind of like the rod. I don't like the fly-by-wire concept with the Husqvarnas or what you see in the Dolmars, because they actually stretch and you end up having to replace them. The rods do not stretch. That's one thing for sure. Kind of interesting. I think I mentioned that I'll probably be saying that a lot in this process. And again, that's kind of an interesting choke lever, all plastic. A lot of it hangs out in outer space. You're asking for trouble in a brush hole. But it's got a pretty decent venturi size. I'm not even going to venture to guess. It's maybe something around 13, somewhere around in that. So it's pretty good size situation going airflow wise with this particular saw. We have a little ring inside there that keeps the manifold from getting crushed, I'm thinking. It's not coming out very well either. We might have to reevaluate that in a minute. Tank vent situation. It's rubber. Squishy, moves quite a bit. And we can see there's a ring similar to what steel does, but the hole going in to the back of the, well, technically the intake manifold in the back of the cylinder is very big, so there's a lot of airflow potential in this particular saw, which means in the end it has a lot of potential once you end up zipping the thing. The other thing I noticed, the spark plug wire comes up on the standard size, but there's a little recess molded into this cylinder cover that accepts the spark plug wire and its little sheath that coats it, which means that it's actually pretty secure right there. So I appreciated that, actually. And for wintertime operation, they have a little system of routing some of the hot air coming off the cylinder back into where the carburetor is. Since the carburetor is kind of like wide open, it's not actually enclosed in a box, so to speak, carb box like we see on a lot of the other saws, Husqvarna, steel. You can look and see that the coil's sitting up high right here, so that's kind of interesting situation balance-wise, if nothing else. Let's look at the handlebars, shall we? Gotta love the KISS method of handlebar mounting. 5 bolts and they fall off into your hands. Hopefully the engineers at Steel are taking note, because their new design is kind of a nosebleed to get apart in all reality. I'm kind of a simpleton. I'm interested in, especially if you're in a hurry at night after you've worked all day, you're tired, you want to come home, you had a problem, you have to replace your handlebar, your tank, whatever. You don't want to spend half of an hour taking these apart. So I'm going to have to retrieve some tools here and there to handle taking this thing apart. And they've got this little rubber doohickey on the end of their compression release, which makes it a little bit of a pain in the butt. To make that function properly. Not standard 14 mil size plug, which is nice. I'm kind of super jazzed about that, actually. It comes with some dual dogs on it. They're not too bad, actually, if you think about it. If we look underneath the hood here on the drive side of the process, kind of a custom situation going here with this. I had to basically modify the standard Husqvarna to Steel spacer for the bar groove to fit on this. It has an 8mm diameter stud, so their studs are really small. Standard, the bigger Husqvarna saws are 9mm. These are 8, so they went that direction. They've got a little strap on the side here like what we see on some of the 562s. The chain catcher is kind of an interesting concept. It's back a ways, but seems like it's going to do okay, except for the fact that with the bar on there, there's room for the chain to blow by there, and the chain will blow by there. If you kick it off going 100 miles an hour, in other words, wide open throttle, you're probably going to end up with the chain getting by there on occasion. Maybe not the first few times, but the chain will wear on this little lip right here on the inside of the clutch cover, and the chain will end up back behind there, and you're probably going to have to take the clutch cover off to get it back on, or get it past the chain catcher. It's nice and open in here. It's canted in a little bit at the bottom. I don't know why they would do that on purpose, but they did. You want it canted away. You're going to catch stuff right here, but the paint's nice and slick. It's got a decent sized chain catcher for a small saw. You got to be careful taking this off, because I did to check it out. and the chain tensioner gear, it's got a little worm gear situation going on in there. That all kind of would just fall out if you're not careful. So you kind of got to watch that aspect of it, though. Kind of didn't really plan on going into that detail necessarily, but it is what it is, I guess. That actually didn't need to come out of there. Let's just take a little closer look at that. And then again, maybe it did. I think I mentioned in the saw test in the tank is actually somewhat opaque, and so you can actually see the fuel in there. I think as long as the that's interesting. So they got a big old pin in there. It sticks off of the clutch cover. It looks, or excuse me, the recoil assembly cover. Huh. So here we go with the interesting. So there's a little return spring on the back side right here. You're going to have to be careful when you take this thing apart that you don't lose that thing onto the bench floor, never to be seen ever again. So in lieu of just prying this thing apart and wrecking something, you can see the little molded piece stud that sticks up essentially that chain brake handle pivots on the flywheel side. So not necessarily simplistic. Let's go with that. And then there's this thing laying over here, so I'm assuming it goes into here like that. We might have to just put that back on so we don't lose that spring, maybe. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting situation where the little molded recess fits over the lever, and that's what's doing the actuation, it looks like. Yeah. How about if we just, like, keep that in place right there? My luck is that thing would pop off and go flying, and you would just never ever see it again. You'd have to deal with getting a new one. At least now we have that thing secure, it's not escaping. Alright. The shroud that does the air guide operation is huge. They're kind of directing it up and over across the top of the cylinder, which is nice. Flywheel is metal. You can see on the back side here, there's a fresh air situation. So that's kind of interesting, the way they get it in there around the back side. So they're getting maybe a little bit of the suction process of the fan concept of the flywheel spinning you can see there's the way it goes, it should be pulling technically though. The air goes this way, doesn't go this way necessarily. So maybe they're actually trying to pull air through. I'm not exactly sure. We're going to have to study that a little bit further since we're looking at the situation here essentially about like that. So the air definitely comes this way. It looks to me like it's going that direction, but there could be enough pressure on that somehow that it's pushing. I don't know. I guess I'll have to look into that further. Three bolts holding that on. 4 bolts holding that on. This little plate here is what keeps the stuff from getting inside and starting a fire. I guess that's an interesting way of doing it. I'm going to go with the Loctite of these. And they use more Loctite on this one than the other one, maybe? Aluminum cooling plate on the back side of the gasket, which looks like it's metal. But the exhaust port is oval, which is kind of interesting. Kind of not necessarily normal. No idea what we're going to find in here, so let's take a look. Well, I don't know if that's actually entirely accurate. But let's take a look for those of us that don't understand what's going on in here. I guess haven't ever seen what's going on in here. So it goes in, comes out, has to hook around and go out. So not super efficient for flow necessarily. Huge fire screen, that's awesome. And there's just a round tube coming out of there. So essentially what they're trying to do is create a tuned pipe situation with the tube coming out. At least that's my interpretation. There's a lot of monkey business in there. It's like some of the older Husqvarnas that had that baffle plate in the middle. It's kind of a concept that looks a little bit along the lines of the SLR tube in the Dolmars in a way. If you think about it, it's not having to come back against itself, but it's going inside there. It's getting through the holes. I'm hoping that you can see those in there. Yeah, I don't know if you can or not, but there's a lot of holes in that baffle plate in there. And then that tube is really long. I'm sure that there's some kind of mathematical equation that they came up with to get that tube the way that it is in there. So that's kind of an interesting situation. This is huge compared to every other saw for the most part. Well, nowadays saws anyway. Weight savings is not necessarily paramount on the list of things that we were considering here, from what I can tell, based on what I'm looking at. They weren't necessarily overly tight. Wow. It's pretty tight on there. So I can't say I'm impressed with how this situation mates up in the back here, if I was to be completely honest. I'm going to have a little look-see in the front and see what's happened here. Base gasket's shredded. And it looks suspiciously close to a actually 346 piston. It's actually shaped in a dome fashion on the top, so I'm going to go with the combustion chamber. It has the same basic shape as well. And lo and behold, we're looking at a mini version 372 XPW cylinder, which is kind of what we were talking about in the beginning. The combustion chamber is kind of sloppy huge, though, unfortunately. But we will take a look at the massive rear version of the transfer port. Again, fresh air's with the fuel charge essentially is coming in. We'll take that out now because it doesn't matter. The hole is huge. It goes to oblong as they come through the transition part. I'm thinking you can see that. But it's big, which is nice. Oval exhaust port, which is kind of interesting. Pretty oval on the outside, so they stayed a little bit more consistent with the shape, kind of oval as it exits essentially the cylinder, and then stays pretty oval. They're not trying to change it a whole bunch, which that's going to be better in concept. At least that's what I'm thinking. But that rear transfer port is absolutely huge. It's bigger as it starts, and it's bigger as it dumps in. So elevation-wise, they're pretty much the same. This cylinder looks really nice inside there, actually. I'm assuming, I'm not sure if this is chrome. It looks chrome, the plating. Not actually positive, but I wish there was a different system going on with this intake manifold. Having to like fit it in there is kind of not too cool. But anyway, if we want to take a look at the crankcase a little bit, we can see it has actually a pretty nice long rod. So I'm going with it's got a pretty nice long stroke. We're going to have to like print up some information in the description area. It's got a nice looking size-wise drive bearing for sure. But it has like that Husqvarna-ish when they went to the quad loop system crankcase, which is kind of nice. So, in my humble opinion, the potential for flow in this thing is huge. Flow equals power. It's got a little wrist pin in it. I'm going to go with 10 millimeter, but it's a little sauce, so there you go. Super glad everything's plastic around here, too. Yeah, 10 millimeter wrist pin. And if we start taking a look at the piston itself, oh, they got a little shim on the inside. That's kind of interesting. Nice reliefs right here in the support area, the bottom side of where the wrist pin goes in, for letting some of the pressure get by, so we're lubricating the bearing. But like I said, the rod's super long, which is kind of nice. Lends itself to a long stroke situation, which in concept I think that's what I was talking about with it. Runs pretty good in stock form. You can feel the difference between like a 362, and then we have to be careful because here's the other thrust washer essentially, so they have one on each side. That's going to make it fun getting that back together in there. So they have two thrust washers. I thought that was kind of weird that they only had one in there. But yeah, super long rod for a little mini saw. So dwell time is good. Again, running this thing, you can't actually feel through the monitor, unfortunately. But we're dealing with 3 holes in the top of the rod for helping to lubricate the bearing, which is actually, that's pretty sweet. It looks like it has pretty good size. Yeah, they're like that 77, 78 size. Needle bearings, and so they have a beefy, it's big, it's wide, and the needle bearings are big in diameter, which that lends itself nicely. I like when the bearing in the upper end of the rod, well, I like both bearings to be bigger actually, but a lot of these new saws have a little tiny bearing in the upper end of the rod, and they're running a big heavy piston. And so this isn't a lightweight piston because it's full circle. And the rings are interesting. They got an interesting look about them. We have one pin in the back, and one of the ring pins is up in the front. So they're trying to separate the amount of distance where the ring end gap essentially is and keep the pressure under control. So there's a lot of things about this saw that are kind of cool and well thought out. And I'm going to go with, this saw has a lot of potential, multiple reasons. It has a lot of potential for charge getting in to the crankcase, which is kind of where it's at with these saws. So as I was rolling through this process in my smaller than average size P cranium, I thought about a couple of points of interest. I thought maybe we'd kind of address them a little bit. So I got some toxic waste in a spray can, and we're going to clean the top of the dome off of this piston so we can take a look at it. And it's hasn't been run too much, and so it's cleaning up super nicely. Actually, it's pretty pristine at this point. Custom cloth right here for the final buff. But anyway, something that I kind of forgot about was, if we take a look at this piston dome, we can see that it has a convex shape to it just generally, but then we can also see that there's about an 1/8 of an inch wide band out at the edge right up to where the skirt and the dome intersect, about an 1/8 of an inch toward the center. There's actually a spot right there. You can see that ring runs around the top of the dome. It's actually concave, so it's a step essentially. The dome is kind of canted up, convex, and then it actually drops down. It's concave at that point, at that intersection right there. And then it continues with the shape of the dome being in a convex shape, essentially to the center, which is where the hole is, essentially. And so I thought that was an interesting piston design. Now, I guess in automobile applications, there are pistons, diesel engines, I think, as well, where the combustion chamber is actually in the dome of the piston. So the piston's recessed so much in there that you see the dome of the piston. You don't see the head because the head's flat, essentially. So I thought that was an interesting concept with this piston because it's just not normal. It's just not a normal thing. So what are they trying to do with that? Well, first thing you have to realize that when you have a concave or a convex shape, convex is this way, concave is this way, there's actually more surface area on the piston itself versus something that's flat, like a piston that's got a flat dome. So there's more surface area when there's a contour, whether it be convex or concave. Now, that gives you more pressure, that the process of combustion, the explosion, is basically gas pressure now that is being applied to the top of the dome. And when there's more surface area, there's actually more pressure applied from any given amount of explosion gases. Interesting concept. But why the lip? You'd think about it in concept, it's going to want to hold that gas, the majority of that gas is coming down. It's going to want to hold it from escaping. It's going to want to keep it acting on the top of the dome a little bit longer. This is my humble opinion that I'm stating right here. I'm thinking about that in concept. As far as charge coming in, that's kind of interesting. There's probably going to be a little bit of turbulence right there at that intersection where it drops down. Is that something that's considered on an engineering level? I have no idea. They don't let me talk to those people. Probably for good reason. And, well, there were some engineers that came out from Sweden one time. We had one of those 385 prototypes, and they did some filming, yada, yada. But anyway, essentially, you can make suggestions. That doesn't mean people will listen to what you suggest. Back on track. Conceptually, the charge is coming in, and there's a little bit of a dip right there in that intersection between the band and the other inside part of the dome. There's going to be a little turbulence. Is that helping the process? Possibly. Is there going to be some of the gases getting trapped as the charge is coming down because it's got to actually escape over a step essentially to get out of the exhaust port essentially, since the exhaust port's in the front now. Food for thought, I guess. Interesting concept. I just thought that was interesting. I forgot to kind of go down that road. The other thing that I forgot about in this process is we're looking at the rings. I don't know if you can see there's a color differential that's really narrow. It's about a 32nd of an inch on this outside edge. So the rings are kind of barrel shaped a little bit. They're not actually completely flat. Most of the time rings are pretty flat. They have like just a perpendicular shape. These are actually kind of rounded. You can feel it when you run your finger across it. So the old 2100, 181 thin ring saws, they actually had barrel shaped rings as well. So the contact patch is really narrow in the beginning. So, you know, you're going to get some wear eventually on that ring, and it's going to seed in essentially, and your contact patch is going to get a little bit bigger as time goes on. But I just thought that was something that was noteworthy that I kind of forgot about. I do apologize for that. And the other thing, when we're kind of wrapping it up, summing it up, I mean, we kind of looked in here at the crankcase a little bit, talked about the rod. I forgot to mention the bore is 45 millimeters and the stroke is 34 as far as I know. It's got a pretty long stroke for such a small little saw, which is why when I ran this thing, it felt like it had good low-end power. Again, talked about the rod being really long, which gives you more dwell time. That lets the process of the combustion gases to act longer at top dead center as rolling around through top dead center technically. On the dome, it's kind of a known quantity in racing applications. They run a real long rod on machines a lot of times. But I was noticing all this extra case material. So, but before that, before I forget, we're canted back with the base. You can see it's canted back like steel. So there's some steel stuff that I'm seeing and some Husqvarna stuff that I'm seeing. It's too bad they didn't mount that spring right in the side of the cylinder and save a whole bunch of weight. And then they got this big old massive beefy thing right here. Essentially, it's like it's gusseted. That adds a lot of weight in the process. It's too bad they couldn't have put that coil back over here somewhere. It actually offsets the weight a little bit that you have going on with your bar. You can run a longer bar and be more balanced when you have a little bit more weight back here. Of course, the position of your main part of your handlebar spar is going to kind of dictate a little bit of that as well, but just generally in concept, if this weight's down here and back, it's going to help offset any longer bar issue. And this comes with a 27, well, the option, it comes with a 27, one of the options. So I think I kind of covered most of it in this process. Again, it's a pound heavier than an MS362, but it's about the same weight as a 562. They're all in that same general 60cc category. And again, I kind of said this saw is going to come alive and start kicking some rear. And that's going to be my prediction on that. And one thing that I'm looking at is the bearing, again, is huge in there. It wouldn't surprise me if they're running 6202 bearings in there, actually, which is a pretty good size bearing for a small saw if you think about it, because some of the bigger 70cc saws have 6202 size bearings in there. And I can't say that I'm exact necessarily, but we won't talk about my bench being a disaster either. I didn't realize I was going to be so impressive. It appears that this bearing, which I haven't ever torn one of these down to know for sure, is along the lines of a 6202 in size on the outside. And so I'm finding that to be kind of interesting. it appears to be It appears to be 6202 in size, the drive side bearing, which, again, that's a pretty big bearing for such a small saw. 372s run this size bearing in them, just as an example. Okay, so we kind of looked at a lot of things with this particular machine. It's probably about time. I have a nice brand new 362 in this shop as well, and so I thought this would be a good time to do some of this comparison testing, comparison looking stuff. Yeah, I think it's a 6202 size bearing in there, and they appear to be the same on both sides as well. That's kind of impressive to me for such a little mini saw like that. I guess in essence that equals bottom end longevity in a lot of aspects, because you're going to wreck something else before you wreck those, generally speaking, provided something weird mechanically doesn't fail. I've seen where the cages kind of disintegrate. I've seen where hard surface of the bearings come off before too, and so anyway, the beefier, generally they hold up better. A lot of extra weight in this design of this machine. I looked at the pistol grip. It has some crosshatch pattern in it. Actually, it's kind of Husqvarna-ish in shape, but it's not smooth. It's textured, so that'll help your fingers with a little bit of extra grip, I would imagine. All right, so we kind of threw a couple other things in there that I kind of spaced on. I do apologize. But that's the way it goes as cobwebs begin to collect in the back of your cranium. And so that's it for this session. I hope you have a blessed day wherever you might be on God's green earth. Thanks for watching.